and welcome everyone to a discussion on code training with Philomena, Quebec.
Hi, everyone. My little presentation, I don't know where it went. Let me find it again. How's it going? So we're going to be, let me pull this up here real quick. I'm with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I'm a policy analyst. And here is my, come on, buddy. All right. Little kerfluffle here. Sorry about that. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about the Chippewa Ceded Territory Food Regulatory System project. This is a project through the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. We call, we call it the agency GLFWIC. It's an intertribal natural resource agency of 11 Anishinaabe tribes in the Upper Great Lakes region. We operate through a delegation of tribal sovereignty to assist our member tribes in coordinating and implementing off-reservation treaty rights. As you can see here, we have 6 divisions, and then we also are really interested in working on recruitment, working with young people from our communities to share about the great career options that we have working in natural resources. And certainly as an agency of our member tribes, GLFWIC strives to infuse Anishinaabe culture and values in all aspects of its mission. And I'll be talking about how we're doing that with respect to this food code project. Here I'll go back one. I'm a policy analyst with GLFWIC. I belong to the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and I've been working for the commission for the past 7 years. I'm also trained as an attorney. So, to start off this discussion, it's really important to think about Anishinaabe food culture, tradition, and economy. As a sovereign nation, a nation that existed and maintained Indigenous governance over a vast area of land for centuries, the production of highly nutritious food for personal, community, and commercial consumption is a really big part of who we are and what we do. So I have a picture here of these fellas out here in the Kakagan sloughs. And I think this is from the early 1970s. They're out harvesting Monomin, wild rice. This is one of our boss foods. And, and this isn't, there's a lot of different aspects of our identity, of our economy, of our relationships, of our communities that are all bound up in our harvesting activities. For a very long time, we have not been able to fully realize the what our food traditions mean. And part of the reason is because our tribes don't have regulations addressing food safety. And so our food producers face a lot of barriers in the marketing and sale of our traditional foods. So this project is meant to address some of those barriers. To give you an idea of what our project is all about, we have a 3-year project that's been funded through the Administration of Native Americans. We're currently in the last couple weeks of this project. The project goals are basically twofold. First of all, we're interested in providing opportunities for tribal programs and our tribal communities with increased access to traditional wild harvested foods. So, to give you an example, my son is, he just graduated from the Bad River Head Start program, and he has, they feed the kids at that program. That's part of the, there's a nutritional component to any Head Start program, any elderly feeding program. He generally ate foods like hot dogs and tater tot casserole, and little bitty carrots that are produced and ordered through a very big um, food production company, and really had no opportunity to eat any of our highly nutritious Ojibwe foods on a regular basis within that program. So, this project, we've heard from our tribal leaders that they're not happy with this situation, and they're really interested in seeing more opportunities for our people to be able to eat our foods in our programming. So that's one aspect of this project. The second aspect is to provide economic opportunities, small business opportunities for our tribal harvesters to sell value added products made from wild harvest foods. We just finished up the bough season in our Ojibwe communities. Bough picking and selling is a big commercial production for the fall, and this is because there's no food safety regulation or anything around bough picking. This is one of these open opportunities for tribal members. There's a lot of families who earn income during this season, because we have a traditional round where there's wild harvested foods that different kinds of wild harvested foods that are available during different seasons. The opportunity to get into this area and have a small business would be an opportunity for more regular amounts of revenue that would be coming into a family, and more like what it was after the treaties were signed. Done some historical research with Jim McClurkin recently, and one of the things that he came up with was a report from Indian agents that was done around the turn of the 20th century, and it was an economic analysis of treaty rights and treaty harvest. And there were some incredible findings that came out of those reports. The average Ojibwe family during this period was earning $30,000 a year in real income during, in the 1800s, late 1800s, on maple sugar production alone. And that we have within my community from Bad River, we have some of our areas where there's an average yearly income of $6,500. So, to be able to realize some additional economic opportunity is something that is really needed. And this is something that our treaty rights can provide. So the things that we have come up with in terms of objectives and outcomes with respect to this 3-year project, we have a model food code for traditional foods. It's comprehensive, and I'll go through one of the aspects of this model food code during this presentation. And then we also have a whole series of reports, scientific literature, and then our own research that has been conducted on food safety related to some of the 16 foods that this project focused on. We also have HACCP plans and SSOPs for traditional food processing. The final aspect that we have coming out of this project is training for harvesters and governmental staff on the model food code and the regulatory system. So just to give you an idea of what the model food code covers, we were able to look at 16 Ojibwe foods. And the reason that we focused on these foods is because during the first year of our study, we conducted some surveys of community members. We received over 300 responses from our community members. And these are the foods that they were most interested in. We also did some targeted questions to our elder advisory board, and they came up with some of the foods as well. So the model food code has been written with 8 chapters. The first 4 chapters provide some general coverage, and then we have the last 4 chapters going into uh, these 4 specific areas. How we've written the model food code is it's meant to address the food safety risks and concerns that were identified within the scientific research. It's tailored to Ojibwe harvesting practices, and it's meant to be no more restrictive than state or federal regulations, but just kind of that Goldilocks level, just meeting those federal and state regulations. I'm going to be talking for the next portion of this presentation on our chapter 8, which is low risk foods. And this is kind of like a cottage food section. As you can see from the organizational structure, we have chapters looking at meat. So this is the white-tailed deer, rabbit, duck, turkey area. And so this is the chapter that focuses on that. And then we have fish, and we're covering whitefish and walleye, that's wild harvested fish. It also includes smoked fish, and then other fish products like roe. Produce is the area that covers our fresh berries, and then other kind of fresh plants that are here. Low risk foods is sort of a catch-all category, and it's the chapter that addresses the wild rice, maple syrup, and then these berry jams and jellies and other products that are similar to those types of products. So, the definition that we're using for low risk foods are these foods that don't require a time and temperature control for safety, or any kind of refrigeration, freezing in order to remain safe. And also foods that have not been shown to support the growth of pathogens. Examples of low risk food include maple syrup, maple sugar, wild rice, jams and jellies, and then pickles, dried fruits and teas, excluding melons, and then candy. And this is not an include like an exclusive list. There's, if you have other foods that fit within those categories, maybe you have spices, different things like that, that would fit within this regulatory standard. So, unlike cottage food laws that you see in many states, this cottage food law is a little bit different. There's a license that's required if this low risk food is produced anywhere other than a tribally licensed food processing plant. So this is certainly an opportunity for people to start up small businesses with maybe a lower capital investment. Licenses are going to be issued by the tribe on an annual basis. They're specific to the location that you're using. So if this is a home business and there's a kitchen in the home, then it would be, that particular location would be licensed. A low risk food license is also not required for the production of monomin or sugar and syrup products for this class 1 monomin and sugar and syrup. So class 1 is a sale from tribal member to tribal member. In order to obtain a license as a class 1 or as a low risk food vendor, a license or application is required. An inspection is also required, and then the payment of any required fees. There's not a fee schedule for this set up in the model food code, but that would be something that we could help develop in the implementation process. So, moderately or high risk foods are not covered within these low risk food regulations. So if you're going to produce products like meat products, fish products, or any kind of produce, you are going to have to, it wouldn't be covered by this chapter. The other chapters of the Model Food Code would cover that. One of the considerations that we have for the these vendors who are producing low risk foods is that you're only going to be producing one type of food, so your low risk foods at the time that you're doing this process. There's also provisions within the Model Food Code for the home production of meat products and fish products, but because those carry a higher risk of food safety concerns, there's going to have to be a separation in time and space between the production of those types of products. The categories of low-risk food vendors, we have two different categories. So if there's a production or if there's revenue of $50,000 in annual sales, or less than $50,000 in annual sales, these foods can be produced in a less formal facility, so not a tribally licensed food processing plant. And there's also exemptions from the general provisions of the Model Food Code that will apply. So instead of going through the whole chapter 3, which covers your SSOPs and a whole number of different provisions, including what you would need for a food processing plant, you have a simplified set of regulations for processing, and we'll talk about those in the next slide. If you have $50,000 or more in annual sales, your your food does have to be produced in a tribally licensed food processing plant, and then you have to comply with the entirety of the Model Food Code, all the applicable chapters, according to the food that you're producing. This $50,000 in annual revenue and annual sales excludes any revenue from Monomin or sugar syrup sales. And so what this means is that Monomin and sugar and syrup are not going to have to be produced within a tribally licensed food processing plant under any provision. If you do have, if you do have a really great jelly business, or you're producing maybe some all kinds of different wild harvested products, at a certain point, there is going to be a need to produce this in a tribally licensed food processing plant, but it's never going to be the case for the production of wild rice or sugar syrup. So in terms of our general requirements, if we're talking about our sales that fall underneath that $50,000 of annual sales, the vendor is, during that inspection, the vendor is going to have to demonstrate an understanding of the applicable food safety standards. So there's going to have to be a discussion about that. Foods will need to be prepared in a manner that's consistent with traditionally safe methods. The water that's used needs to be potable water. And then, there's some other specific provisions. If you're using produce, you're trimming that and cleaning that before you're processing it. And then any kind of person who is preparing, packaging food, engaged in the food production process, needs to engage in hygienic practices, washing hands, and they're not sick with some kind of contagious disease. With respect to these specific requirements around processing, we're not engaging in other domestic activities while we're producing our food. So this means not preparing your own meal. And then we're going to keep our premises, our tools, our equipment clean and sanitary in compliance with our traditionally safe methods. On this point, this food code meant to um, is not meant to be an extreme deviation from the manner in which traditional foods are being processed today. And it's not, the creation of this food code is also not to say that the way in which our Ojibwe communities are producing food is unsafe. Um, in many parts of the food code, what we're what we're using are what we're saying is that these traditional food methods have been safe and have been proven safe over many periods of many periods of time, but that it's just important to have, in order to create that opportunity for sale within a United States food market that's highly regulated. It's important to demonstrate that there are regulations in place and standards in place within our communities. Um, you know, this is very consistent. No animals are allowed in the workspace while we're preparing food. I mean, this is very consistent with our traditional cultures and our traditional practices around food. And then we're wearing cleanable clothing. We're the clothing that we're wearing is clean. We're washing our hands sufficiently. Any kind of materials that we're using for packaging are going to be clean and dry prior to their use, or they're going to be single-use containers. And you know, this is also consistent with the standards generally within the Model Food Code. So, low-risk foods can be produced outside of food processing plants, and again, we have some exceptions um, to our regulations for maple syrup, maple sugar, and monomin, wild rice. So when you're producing your low risk foods outside of a food processing plant, this is similar to a cottage food. We have a direct to consumer requirement, so it's a direct sale to your consumers, with the exception of these other products. And so, I did talk earlier about our historical production of maple sugar and maple syrup. Monomin, our wild rice, is also a food that, because it's shelf stable, because it's a low risk food, is a food that was used for commercial sale, and it has been sold commercially to a whole number of different people, traded among tribes, but also sold to non-tribal people for generations, probably for centuries. And and so there, this food can be safely produced outside of a highly controlled food processing environment. And in fact, it's critical that this food continues to be produced outside of food processing plants for the continuation of our traditional culture on food. These foods are oftentimes foods that bring our communities together. So at the wild rice harvesting season and then at the maple sugar production time, this is when our people come together. We come to our rice lakes, we come to our ricing areas in the fall. It's a really celebratory traditional food practice, and then that coming together continues when we're processing those foods. And because of the way these foods are processed, these indigenous foods, it's really not necessary for them to be processed in a food processing plant. We also have a lot of teachings around the production of these foods. There's teachings around maple sugar and maple syrup about how at one point the sugar and the syrup actually came directly out of the trees, and at a certain point the Wenabuju saw the Anishinaabe getting really lazy, and so at that point, the creator changed the way that the maple tree worked, so that instead of having this sap just running as syrup out of the tree, that the Anishinaabe had to work for the production of these foods. And so, the hard work that goes into the maple syrup is important for preserving the integrity of those foods. So that's the reason that we have these provisions in here, these exemptions. The other thing that we do want to note is that if we have sales taking place off reservation, vendors of these foods might be requested to or required to comply with state law around the production, like the small product, or they're the cottage food laws might apply to the production of these foods. And so there's nothing really in the low risk food chapter that's likely to um, be inconsistent with what would be required under a state cottage food law. There might be another license that's required, but we can certainly take a look at that, and even out any kind of differences in the implementation process. So we're going to talk about Jiwa Gamizi Ganike, making syrup. What we found through our research is that maple syrup is a safe, low contaminant indigenous food. In the research, we actually engaged in some research with some labs. We obtained samples of sap and syrup from a number of different tribal producers to look at a whole list of possible chemical contamination within this product. And we found that it's very low in chemical contaminants when it's produced in the absence of lead food contact surfaces. Something to keep note of is that chemical residues can be found in maple syrup if your cleaning chemicals are not properly used and if they're not removed before use. So it's really important to keep track of that. That would be a source of chemical contamination if there's any. And the other thing to keep track of is our lead food contact surfaces. What we're telling our tribal harvesters is that you can get a lead test at a hardware store. It's pretty easy to do, especially if you have any kind of old equipment or equipment that's been passed down, and do a simple lead test to make sure that you don't have any problems. You're going to want to look at old equipment. You're also going to want to look at any soldering that might have been done on trays or other types of metal equipment, because that could be a source of lead contamination. The biological concerns with respect to syrup are very low because there's a high sugar content in this liquid, and there's just less water available for that any kind of bacteria to grow. The other consideration that we have when we're talking about biological concerns is that the production includes boiling. It requires boiling, and this is a kill step. So these kill steps are processes that reduce or eliminate pathogens to an acceptable level. In terms of the model food code, we have a few standards. There is a requirement that the sugar content of the finished syrup is measured, and so the standard is that syrup is a liquid derived from sugar-rich tree sap, which is not less than 66 degrees Brix. And that can be tested with a hydrometer or a refractometer, as long as that equipment is appropriate for the use. Sometimes they have to be calibrated prior to the use, so you're going to want to do that. And then there's also a requirement that food contact surfaces for syrup and sugar production are cleaned and sanitized prior to their use. Or if these are continuously being used for a boiling process, there needs to be a break at least every 40 days to clean and sanitize these, these food contact surfaces. So, your equipment that are coming into contact with your maple syrup, sap, or your product, it needs to be food grade or non-toxic. And you're going to keep your sap cool and covered so it doesn't spoil. And, I think people are doing this anyway. A lot of these things, people are doing these things anyway. We're simply writing these down to make sure that other regulators, possible consumers of this project or of these products understand that there are standards that are being followed. So one thing that we've done within this model food code is set up different classes or classifications of food. And this is primarily to create different options for producers to step into commercial sales. Class 1 foods are foods that are sold to tribal members only. And so this is this is an opportunity for people to be much more creative in the process. There's a lower regulatory requirements for these class 1 foods. And again, we don't need a low risk vendor license. It's not required for the sale of maple syrup, maple sugar. Class 2 and 3 foods. Class 2 foods are foods that are meant for sale to a tribal program. The goal with this project is to eventually provide opportunities for programs to use their federal funds and tribal funds in order to purchase these foods. And then class 3 foods are retail sales to anyone, anywhere in the world. So for class 2 and 3 maple sugar, maple syrup, you're going to have your low risk vendor license. And you're also going to have an inspection done by your tribal regulatory authority. There's standard product labeling that will need to be applied to the finished product. The labeling requirements are pretty much identical to what the federal standards are. And then your final boiling and packaging of the product. So the final boiling of the product has to occur within a licensed food processing plant or a premise that is exempt from 21 CFR 1.225. And this is a regulation within the way that the PHMSA, so the Food Safety Modernization Act, is regulated by the FDA, that requires an annual inspection of premises. Residents are exempt from this FDA PHMSA inspection. And so this is an opportunity for our, it's important, like I said, it's important for tribal producers to be able to continue on with the traditional practices that they have. Oftentimes, our maple products are not produced in a sterile environment. However, because we do have that kill step, that final boil, it's not essential for this food safety of that product for the entire production, for the entire boil to occur within a sterile environment like a food processing plant. I'm gonna kind of blast through Monomin. Monomin is also a very low risk food. It's a safe food. Any kind of food safety risks are pretty minimal, and they're really already addressed by our traditional processing techniques. So, we're addressing mold by either drying or parching our rice after we get off the lake. We're storing our rice in cool, dry locations. People are really careful, Ojibwe people, really, really careful with the way that we are producing Monomin because it takes a lot of work. It's a lot of work to go out there and harvest our rice. And we're really pretty proud of how we get our rice going. Um, the main physical risk that we have with Monomin is maybe sand and rocks. So we're keeping track of any kind of inedible material that's within our finished rice product, so that people don't bite down on a pebble. That's embarrassing if you're a rice producer. There's a bacterial concern if we're talking about cooked rice, and what we're telling food producers to do if you're dealing with a cooked rice product is we're keeping our cooked rice either hot or cold, to reduce the risk associated with the growth of that product. Um, with respect to Monomin processing standards, there's very little in the Model Food Code. It basically says that wild rice production is needs to be in line with the cultural practices of your community, and these cultural practices may include the use of machines. We're checking our rice, our finished product, for any hard inedible particles, and then you're examining it. If you look at this bit of rice that's almost a finished rice product, if you check out, there's a little bit of stuff in here, and you're just going to pick that out while you're processing your rice. If you're packaging low risk food, you need to use the appropriate kind of packaging material. So you're either using a clean single use container, or containers that were cleaned and sterilized prior to their use. And of course, we're using food safe materials for our packaging. We have an example of a wild rice label here. And we're going to have on the PDP, the first portion, the most prominent portion of our label, we're going to have our statement of identity, our net quantity statement. And then any artwork shouldn't detract from this label. We have some additional standards on how you can talk about wild rice. Contained within the food code, natural wild rice it has to be our traditional hand harvested wild rice. Labels are available at Glyphwick for Monomin for our Glyphwick tribal members. If there's somebody else who's interested in this label, we can probably share the electronic copy of it. Low risk food also contains some standards around jams, jellies, and pickles. These are acidified foods, and the real standard that we have here is to make sure that the pH of this final product is 4.6 or lower. And producers are going to need to keep some records of the documentation of the pH measurement of each batch. Everything else is pretty much consistent with what I've talked about before. I am done with my presentation. I'm really interested to hear if we have comments or questions, feedback. In summary, our Glyphwick Chippewa Ceded Territories Traditional Food Regulatory Project, it's about providing our member tribes with technical assistance to implement food regulations that reflect Anishinaabe food culture and traditions. As a reminder, this is also about providing access to these foods and then economic opportunities for tribal communities. Our Glyphwick Model Food Code, we have a chapter that addresses low-risk foods that are offered for commercial sale. Again, these may be produced outside of tribally licensed food processing plants. We do have some record retention requirements, especially when we're talking about acidified jams, jellies, pickles. Wild rice and maple syrup and sugar are low-risk foods that qualify for exemptions from many of the provisions in this chapter, and also specialized labeling. Miigwech gab is in dai wieg. I I have my contact information here and available for you. Thank you so much for listening. And as a as a reminder, this is an ANA project, and so the products that we have produced throughout this project, including our contaminant reports, our SSOPs, our model food code, is all going to be available on the Glyphwick website. We're just in the final processes of finding a spot for it right now, working with our IT folks. But if you do have questions about it, please give me a jingle. My email address is here. I can send you a copy of the model food code if that's something you're interested in. So right now I'm gonna break, and I'm gonna ask Stephen if there's any questions that have come up.
So we do have a few questions. That was an excellent presentation, Philomena, and I had forgot to shoot out a big thank you for all the sponsors. This particular session is sponsored by the Champions of Native Agriculture. And while we're here, let's remind folks to click on the live Q&A tabs at the bottom right of the screen next to sessions. And let me go over here and read some of these questions. So there was a question asking how whether or not your work was instrumental in initiating the American Indian Traditional Foods and USDA School Meals Program, or any relation to the USDA School Meals Program.
Oh, okay, sure. No, it hasn't. We really haven't had a very much contact with USDA about this project at all. I mean, we did have some correspondence with the Food and Nutrition Service, I think last year about this. And I mean, what we've been really focused on is developing this standard, and I think some of those questions related to the school nutrition programs are going to be something that will come after tribes start actually implementing this project. And we have had a lot of conversations with the Department of Agriculture in the state of Wisconsin itself, and we've had some really hopeful signs that they're interested in working with us and moving forward on the implementation of this. So I think some of those questions are yet to be resolved.
Oh, but y'all are working on it. Excellent.
Yeah.
Uh, so another question reads: Are major foods currently at high risk food? I'm sorry. Are major foods currently are high risk foods such as fish, smoked fish, elk, deer? We're losing our traditional practices and internal, external trade and economy. How to alleviate traditional practices with this type of food? And I think you did address that in the presentation, but we'll leave that to you.
Yeah, and to the person who asked this question, I would be happy to send you our model food code and then our training manual that we've developed that contains all the scientific contamination reports. I think what I think what is really important to talk about when we're talking about regulators and we're talking about our traditional foods, even foods that are high risk, is that our cultures around food and our cultures around food production have already addressed food safety risks. And even though maybe our people weren't talking in terms of HACCP and SSOPs, I can think of a whole number of our traditional stories around food and like my grandma's telling me about food and how you do things, that maybe it's a different way of getting at the same thing.
Mm.
And certainly one of the struggles that we have when we've been doing this project is this idea that, well, why do we need HACCP if we've already done these things in a good way? HACCP is a great tool for making sure that we're addressing things in a systematic way, and it doesn't have to be inconsistent with the ways that we've been doing things, with the ways that we've been doing our food production all along. The other thing is, like, if we're there's a difference between the way that we prepare foods for our family, and the way that we do things in a traditional way if we're doing things for a feast. And there's also a difference when we're talking about our commercial production. And for commercial production, because we're going to be getting this additional benefit with this revenue, sometimes it does make sense to take that additional step and employ these practices that oftentimes just require documentation, writing down, here's my plan for keeping my food area safe. Everybody's washing their hands before they come onto the production floor, even if they've already been doing that. I mean, some of these things are just about making sure that we have the documentation to back up these practices that we've already been doing.
Wonderful. And I don't see any other questions. But this is a wonderful example of a thoroughly developed food code directly applicable to the traditionally important food. And it was a pleasure to be on here with you.
Yeah. It's been such a satisfying project. And it's part of my work has been, like, as somebody who, I don't know, is a lawyer, I guess.
Mm.
It's it's been really important for me to get as engaged in the production of as many of these foods as I've possibly been able to. And so, I've really tried to step up, and I think the biggest step up that I've had, and the is just the wild rice production. I think I was out about 8 times this year harvesting rice with my with my ricing buddies. And I do appreciate the fact that the pandemic has allowed me to engage in conferences and different things from my home, so I haven't had to be on the road all the time. That's been really helpful in this last year. So, I think it's important for us to, um, not just talk about these things, but actually do them.
Mm.
And engage in food production, even if it's a small thing. I harvested maybe a couple pounds of jelly or a couple pounds of grapes this year, and I made 2 little pints of jelly. And it's for Ojibwe people, we have this obligation and this responsibility, and probably for other people, I don't know, but we have this responsibility to get back to our food ways and harvest those things that are available, because those grapes that are out there, those Monomin that are out there, they want us to do that. That's part of our obligation as Anishinaabe. Those are our original instructions. That goes back to our law again. Like, we need to be doing this for the health of those places, for the health of our communities, for the health of ourselves.
There's no doubt that even like from an ecological standpoint, we may be the keystone species. So I have a few more questions that have come in. So this one reads, I'm the business manager for a native cafe. When trying to source wild harvested mushrooms like chaga and morels, can you speak on how safe sources are regulated by tribes? How can I safely source wild harvest mushrooms? And there are some modern code that address this.
Yeah, so our model food code, our produce chapter addresses mushrooms, and we have some specific standards around mushrooms. One of the things that we require our tribal mushroom producers to do is to have a um, have a certification in mushroom identification.
Mm,
These are offered currently by a number of different states. And so I don't know of any tribal certification program that's currently available. What we're telling our tribal producers or our tribal mushroom pickers to do is to do that state program and get that
mm,
certification. And then the other thing that we require for mushrooms is there's a labeling standard for mushrooms. So you have to have a label that has the harvester name, harvester address, the time of harvest or the date of harvest,
mm,
and then the common and scientific name of that mushroom species. The other thing that we require is appropriate packaging for mushrooms. So you're
mm,
going to have aerobic packaging, packaging that lets the air, lets the mushroom breathe. Because if they're in an airtight container, you might have biological or chemical concerns that come up. I know of a mushroom harvester in Bad River right now, who is doing some commercial sales. He's doing some sales of to our local co-op.
mm.
I would be more than happy to put you in touch with him. So please do shoot me an email, and I'll get you through. We don't have any of our tribes that have adopted the model food code right now, and the pandemic is really the thing that tribal governments are focused on.
Mhm.
I've been to several tribal council meetings in the last couple months, and we have staff that are out or that are quarantined, unavailable. Um, and then we also have just a whole number of governmental issues around COVID funds and closures and different kind of concerns. So the tribes have not taken up this model food code, and that's actually not surprising. Hopefully we'll find some remedies to the pandemic. Things will calm down in
Mm.
that arena, and tribes will able to kind of open up and take on looking at different things and starting different projects like this model food code. It's kind of a big thing to start. Um, but that would be the advice that I'd give you right now. There can be there are some folks who are doing things under state regulations at this point.
And there's a new inexpensive test to determine if a mushroom is poisonous or not. That probably isn't met any kind of regulation or approval yet, but that's in the works. So that's going to be great. And I imagine that by even having this code that y'all are gonna you've laid the groundwork for even more tribal producers to get engaged. Okay, we have a few more questions. So um, was research regarding traditional food preparation carried out by the tribe? And they may be asking, did y'all send finished samples off to be tested elsewhere? Or
Sure. So I'm not the environmental biologist that was engaged in this, but what we did for our studies, for our original research related to food safety is created QAPs for to make sure that we have quality assurance in the sampling, and then implemented those QAPs. There was a lot of contact that went out to our various tribal communities we have a monthly meeting of the Voight Intertribal Task Force that engages with 11 or 10 of our tribes on off-reservation treaty rights activities. And so we did a lot of engagement through that, and then directly with tribal reps about the fact that we would be collecting samples of these various different products. And then the environmental biologists went out and actually picked things up from different areas, and stored things really safely. These There was some I know she was engaged in like turkey, the collection of turkey breasts, and so she was in the labs and actually cutting open the turkey breasts and doing different things. taking those breasts over to get x-rayed. One of the things that we were looking at was lead in meat that was harvested, lead contamination from ammunition. So there was a lot of engagement with our tribes in the collection of samples, so that we were collecting representative samples that would correlate back to traditional food that people would actually be eating. The scientific analysis was done by LSRI, I believe, and then another lab out of Green Bay. That's a non-native entity. I'm not sure if we have any labs that are within the Great Lakes that are tribally owned facilities.
Excellent, excellent, and there's several folks have just complimented you on the presentation, and someone had mentioned that the state of Wisconsin had recently changed its wild mushroom harvest retail sale reg, so as an FYI, and
Oh, okay, great. Thank you for that.
yeah, well, we're 2 minutes out to the next round, so if you're ready, we can close this session and give everybody a restroom break.
Chimi Gwitch, really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. It was great to put a face to the name.
Yeah, excellent. I hope wishing you guys all health and good wishes.
Well, Shvislacho, we'll see.
Hello, everybody. This is Latasha with the IAC. I'm the American Indian Foods Program Director, and I have our co-host, Mike Schellenberger, with me today. I am going to go ahead and, oh, okay, 1 second. Great. Thank you so much. Sorry. Perfect. Never mind.
All right. Sorry about that, Latasha. I guess I got to learn to read a little more carefully, and sorry for everybody for the few minute delay. I'm Michael Schellenberger, USDA Technical Assistant Specialist for Indian Tribes in Washington State, and I work for Intertribal Agricultural Council. And I want to welcome everybody. Today, this session, we're going to be getting some information about the FSMA training. And first off, we're going to have I hope I get this right, Josiah Griffin, and he's a native Hawaiian and program and policy specialist for the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, bringing over 5 years of experience in analyzing tribal implications of federal policy and supporting increased access to agricultural resources. And then next up, we're going to have a Whitney Sawney, I'm sure she'll clarify that. A citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She's the communications manager and program specialist of the indigenous, oh, I'm so sorry, guys, Food and Agricultural Initiative at the University of Arkansas, Office of of Economic Development, the IFAI. Thank you.
Great, so I think it's over at us now. So hello everyone, as he mentioned, my name is Whitney Sawney. I wanna thank you for joining our team at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative for our session today, and focused actually on the Indian Country Community Asset Directory, and an overview of bridging economies of scales for nonprofits. And first of all, before we get started, I do want to thank IAC and their entire team for all the hard work and having us here to share more about the asset directory, because I know that conferences are hard work and I just want to acknowledge all of the effort put forth by their team and bringing us all together virtually. So we're grateful for you all joining us for this presentation. And as I mentioned, we are here to talk about the Indian Country Community Asset Directory, which is an online platform developed in partnership with Crystal Echohawk and her team, our partners at Arabella Advisors. The website itself was designed by the native-owned Buffalo Nickel Creative, and this is all thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for the support of the project as well. Jumping into an overview of who we are at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative and our work in Indian Country, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Josiah Griffin.
So aloha kaku, my name is Josiah Griffin. I am Native Hawaiian and I'm the Program and Policy Specialist with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. So as we are kind of moving forward through our discussion today with you, we'll be framing our discussion through a few different points, kind of leading into an overview of what the Indian Country Community Asset Directory is, some of its usability and function, and from there, we'll be bridging into a conversation on how to leverage philanthropic partnerships to scale agricultural enterprises, which really are kind of the backbone of the community asset directories, the backbone of kind of what we're doing here, building out kind of a directory of a community-driven, funder-focused model. And finally, we'll be wrapping up the conversation by kind of wrapping up with an actual community asset directory website demonstration. So before we start delving into the conversation about what the community asset directory is in full, it might be helpful to frame some of our work at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. So one of the first questions that I always end up hearing, and Whitney, I'm sure it's the same way for you, is why did you start in the University of Arkansas? And so it really came out as a serendipitous partnership. As Janie Sims Hip, who is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, was leaving the Department of Agriculture, serving Secretary Vilsack, she had a longstanding connection with, at that time, Dean Stacy Leeds, who is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And Dean Leeds was the first woman dean who is Native American of a law school across the country. And so as we were looking at kind of how to continue moving this conversation forward, the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative was established in 2013. Now, as we kind of build into our work leading into today and leading into kind of our conversations with partners, we really frame our work as kind of working to enhance health and wellness in tribal communities by advancing healthy food systems, diversified economic development, and cultural food traditions in Indian country. And so as we're doing as we're kind of acting as a partner in this way, we are also working to provide and support for legal and policy governance infrastructure through strategic legal analysis, policy research, and educational resources, really aiming to empower Indian country through food sovereignty, agriculture, and economic development in a way that is on their own terms, is also community and tribal driven. So we engage this space through a number of ways. Just as Indian countries' food systems are vast and there are a number of different touch points, we're working to support tribal nations and tribal food systems and kind of navigating these spaces through the development of a model tribal food and agriculture code to support governance considerations. We are a research partner for the Native Farm Bill Coalition, which is a coalition of over 170 tribes from across the country to help inform Farm Bill implementation and decision-making. We work with the US Food and Drug Administration as the Tribal Food Safety Alliance and to help build out a stronger Native food safety and integrated network. We also support Native youth on an annual basis through our Native Youth in Food and Agriculture Summer Leadership Summit, where we bring in and host American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian youth from across the country to do a deep dive on aspects in agriculture that will kind of impact them now and also impact them in their future career development. We're regularly building out our work through that tribal-driven focus and a cultivating tribal food sovereignty approach, facilitating agricultural production through that food sovereignty lens. And in doing that, we're kind of supporting Native food enterprises and scaling up, identifying and pre-digesting policy frameworks that are on the horizon, like what we've seen with the rollout for hemp codes. And kind of reframing this is a way of kind of helping support longevity in food security and food access for tribal communities nationwide. So with that, I will turn it back over to Whitney.
Sounds great. Thank you, Josiah. So I would like to provide a little bit more background on the directory itself. So ultimately, this is a living resource that elevates and amplifies food and agriculture and health equity innovations in Indian country. So this directory is, as Josiah had mentioned, community driven and funder focused. And thanks to the research conducted by Illuminative, we know that 3% of philanthropic funding goes to Indian country, which is a small number. And 2/3 of that funding then defaults to non-Native organizations working with Indian country. And with that in mind, the purpose of this online directory is to really break down the barriers to philanthropic investment in food systems work and health equity work led by tribal governments, Native producers, tribally owned enterprises, and Indigenous food and health experts. In the development of the directory, our partners at Arabella Advisors led an initial funder needs assessment, in which this assessment helped identify what those barriers and challenges were to investing in Native-led food sovereignty efforts. And that assessment found that barriers included things like a lack of basic knowledge about Indian country and cultural competency, or a lack of understanding of how sometimes those grant-making strategies and practices can sometimes perpetuate already existing inequities. So there was a need for a tool that could effectively and efficiently filter by issue areas or geographies or audience base to help funders identify those Native-led entities leading this innovative work. So to build this directory, our team at IFAI utilized a 2-tiered survey approach with survey structures that would allow for communities to self-define their own work and tell their own story. Because as we mentioned several times, I'm going to keep reiterating this point that this is community driven. And this comes from the people that the programs serve. Our initial survey that was sent out was open to everyone. It was accessible online, through social media, through the website, through conferences like this, and shared out to audiences of our partner organizations. And the survey was a tool that was used to nominate a program or a project or an organization in the community that anyone knew of leading this work. People could also self-nominate in this process. And then we developed a second level survey, and that was sent to all of the nominated entities focused on defining what makes their work innovative and what makes their work successful, which helped then inform the structure of the directory itself. So I do want to briefly touch base on some of the top line findings and tell the story of what our initial surveys found. So Josiah, if you want to go to the next slide, please. This word cloud reflects the most frequently used words to describe the work that, that is being led by these organizations. And as a part of our survey process, we asked entities to nominate, or we asked the entities nominated to expand on what their work is focused on. And more than half of the nominees are directly engaged with their community. And you can see that with words such as community, traditional, sovereignty. These are all reflected here in this word cloud as the most frequently used words. And then the next slide shows more of a geography scope of across Indian country and the regions of the entities nominated. So 41% of those entities identified serve a single tribal community, while 14% serve Indigenous people nationwide. Then we also have an overview on the next slide of an organizational creation. So the reason that these entities were created in the first place. And 54% were created or founded by community members to address an issue, for example, food insecurity or access to healthy and traditional foods. And 14% were created by tribal governments. And then we go into defining success here on the next slide. And this reflects how success was defined by the organizations nominated. And so 89% of them, which is a large majority, had a focus on tradition and culture. And they said that that's what makes their work a success. And then that's sort of an overview of the top line data takeaways that really help tell the story about the asset directory and what it represents for Indigenous-led food systems and health equity work. So I'll actually turn it over to Josiah to expand more about how you can leverage these opportunities and utilize this platform as a nonprofit.
Thank you, Whitney. So as we're discussing opportunities to kind of leverage and partner more effectively, I'm framing this, and I want to frame this in a little bit of a different way, at least to start. And I know some of you might be looking at this graph saying, you know, you're in the wrong subject area. This really should be talking about economics. But as we're talking about opportunities to leverage and opportunities to kind of build on the efficiencies of the nonprofits that are working in this space and that are serving their communities in a good way, we really have to talk about how partnership is structured and how that structure impacts the community asset members or organizations' ability to do good work in a good way that isn't cost prohibitive. And so as we're looking at this, we've built it out in terms of this framework of an economy of scale. And for anyone who's not familiar with kind of the definition of what an economy scale is, or maybe it's just been a little while, we can generally think about it as the ability of an organization or enterprise to use or develop a cost advantage by maintaining and promoting and building into their own kind of organizational efficiencies. And so the idea here is that as you have one more unit of production or one more unit of service that the community asset member is able to provide to their kind of stakeholders or to their service area, either their average costs are going to go down by kind of them being able to kind of work in this space and add additional quantity or quality to that work, where their average total cost is going to increase. And so as we are kind of building into this perspective of kind of how do you navigate that, right? How do you build into the differences for if we are supporting community assets in a way that will mitigate costs or in a way that actually is constraining their effectiveness. Some of the things that we might look at are how can program output scale rather than kind of increase the average cost for providing a product or service, and how can scaling program outputs be goods, services that are provided by community assets. So how can those outputs scale social impact? As we're kind of moving forward, the goal of, I generally assume that the goal for funding these organizations is to support their ability to serve their community members in a better or a broader way. And so as we are looking at kind of building into this idea of economies of scale. As the marginal cost of implementing a program or a service kind of decreases the average total cost as you move kind of down in this space, you're working in an economy of scale. And in doing so, you are, again, building into the advantage that a firm is able to achieve. By firm, I am also meaning like community asset here, that the community asset achieves through targeted strategies that increase production or service levels while proportionately saving cost. And if you are thinking about opportunities to kind of support organizations in building out or implementing an economy of scale, one ready example might just kind of generally be kind of providing capital financing for infrastructure so that organizations would be able to assign staff that are kind of managing those kind of day-to-day administrative operations into tasks that are kind of more robust in kind of moving the needle on what their program or project level looks like. But if you are looking at kind of if something is framed in a situation or a context where the organization is moving into a diseconomy of scale, they're moving into a space where you might be operating above and beyond what your efficiencies readily allow for. And so you have to kind of redouble efforts in kind of the time that it takes to provide a service, or you have to kind of move into this space where you're not operating as efficiently as you otherwise could be. And so we can generally reference these as like operational and market constraints that increase the cost per unit of production. And so if a funder was to come in and try to partner with a community asset member in a way that didn't reflect the community-driven kind of basis of that asset's operational structure, you might inadvertently be moving them into a space where they are operating in a diseconomy of scale. So why does this philosophy matter? Like, why should we even be considering whether or not we're operating in an economy or a diseconomy of scale? And now I think is one of kind of the best times to start looking at these things if we haven't already, because COVID-19 has bubbled up issues in supply chains and food access for Indian country that tribal communities have already been facing, but in many ways it's exacerbated these issues. And so as we're looking at an emerging situation or an emergent situation where there are pressing needs and there's this idea of acting now, there may be easy to kind of want to step in as a funder or step in as a partner immediately without taking a look at what's actually necessary and what would actually be the most helpful for the communities that you're operating with or intending to partner with in that service area. And so we're kind of building into this space. We can also think about how markets for resources and supplies can be competitive. And especially as we're operating or are working with kind of nonprofit organizations or other types of community assets, the ability to tap into these resources may either be scarce or may either be otherwise be kind of difficult to kind of acquire because they are cost prohibitive. And so in kind of stepping in as a partner, it may be a matter of helping to open up markets, open up areas of service through infrastructure or through kind of building networks of connection. As we are kind of moving into this space too, we kind of must kind of operate within the understanding that there is, generally speaking, there's need out there, right? These community assets are here for a reason. They are trying and they're working to serve their community and to make a difference. But as they are kind of providing these services, their ability to kind of access and utilize and capitalize on resources can be kind of cost prohibitive. And in doing so, it makes it harder to compete with kind of larger enterprises that are otherwise operating in this space. So there's generally like a concern of being priced out of the market, where you can't acquire the goods that you need to operate and do what you're supposed to do within your mission or your objective. And so as a funder or as a partner, you might be able to help them in offsetting some of these kind of costs associated with kind of navigating these economies of scale one way or the other. And as we look at this kind of overall, right, across the board, the ability of community assets to scale in a way that supports food systems will become increasingly important. We are dealing with ever complex legal and commercial and economic environments. And so being able to support community assets and support Indian country food systems as a partner will help support and provide for the longevity of food access and the ability of communities of tribal nations to really feed themselves on their own terms, which underlies the essence of food sovereignty. So we've talked about kind of what it looks like to build out economies of scale. And so as we're thinking about opportunities to partner, we wanted to break down some more concrete examples of ways that you might partner with a community asset in building out either or supporting internal and external economies of scale. And so well, starting out by looking at kind of internal economies of scale as a reference point, kind of one of the first things that you might look at and might consider is kind of capital infrastructure investments, which may otherwise be kind of cost prohibitive for the nonprofit organization that you would be working with. As I'm kind of walking through the frameworks or some considerations for internal economies of scale and how to work with nonprofit organizations in Indian country, I also want to underline and underscore that these partnerships should really be conducted in a way that that supports and empowers their efficiencies, supports and empowers their ways of looking at things, how they define outputs, how they define service to their community, what their culture tells them is appropriate and is kind of meaningful to do in serving their community in this way. And so how like capital infrastructure investments may be proposed may be a little different than what you've traditionally expect to hear through other conversations or discussions with non-native entities. And so being open-minded and kind of coming to the table with a position of understanding and a position of listening and a position of partnership and support that long-term relationship building. So some additional considerations for supporting and empowering internal economies of scale may refer to helping organizations build out and develop their staff expertise, so that as their staff members become more effective or efficient in navigating situations on their own, their their work and their service level and their ability to serve their community expands and builds with them. Some considerations may also refer to helping support increased operational efficiencies, like looking at different technologies and innovations to help streamline some of this work. Inventory management, as we're especially looking at what it means to build out a food system and a food supply chain in Indian country. The general consideration, of course, that many people kind of defer back to with looking at an economy of scale kind of also refers to nonprofits, right? How do you spread out the fixed costs of what they're doing over a broader output level? And then finally, kind of operating in a way, like I said, that you are leveraging community partnerships in separate organizations as a partner first. As we're looking at some considerations for building out and empowering external economies of scale, those aren't firm specific, but those might be more market specific. So how do you set up an environment or support an environment for native food systems that empowers and kind of reinforces the ability of community assets to thrive in this space? And so kind of helping to support kind of this network or framework of community and tribal government investment or policy might be an important role. And that's something that the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative has worked to do through our Model Tribal Food Code, helping to support and build out community assets and infrastructure so that community members are more readily able to take advantage of the offerings that are made available through these community assets. Support for nearby education institutions like tribal colleges and tribal universities, which allow, which help to kind of inform the next generation of leaders for how to work in this space, and some considerations that they might want to use in managing expectations. And so as kind of we're building out education institutions and the kind of student base, the learning opportunity within the community and supporting that, there is kind of a different pool of individuals that organizations might be able to work with or hire so that they can operate in a way that moves the needle in a good way. And then of course, as we're looking at how do you support kind of building out these food system markets to empower community assets as their own enterprises and organizations, being available as a partner is necessary to actually kind of work through this. So as we're kind of looking at how all of these things apply to the Indian Country Community Asset Directory, I know Whitney will be walking through, Whitney will be presenting a walkthrough of the asset directory in real time. But we wanted to highlight a couple of pieces in advance so that as you're thinking about these things, as you're thinking about ways to align your mission and ways to partner more effectively in service to kind of specific stakeholders or specific target populations or areas of operation, the asset directory allows for building out those connections and identifying partnership opportunities. And kind of looking at this too, we've also referenced this as a framework of recognizing the efficiencies and the network and body of knowledge that is already available and in place in Indian country. And so I would be remiss without kind of highlighting the profiles and innovation that have so graciously shared their information with us so that it can be posted on the community asset directory as kind of partners in being able to help inform some of these decisions moving forward. So if you have questions, if you have comments, we're more than happy to talk with you after this event, during this conversation here today. But we did also want to make sure that you had copies of the email addresses for each and every one of our staff. So please feel free to reach out to us with any comments, questions, thoughts, as we would love to be able to talk with you. So with that, I will turn it back over to Whitney.
Great, thank you, Josiah. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Josiah, just give me a quick confirmation. Is that being shared?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, perfect. So here is the actual asset directory website. So the URL is indiancountryassetmap.com. It's kind of a long domain there. Sorry about that. But here on the homepage, you will see first and foremost our interactive map. So one of the takeaways and some of the feedback we received through the funder needs assessment for how this directory can be interactive and based off what filters would be helpful to identify those native-led entities to be able to really support their work and start with that relationship building. One of the feedbacks was requesting a breakdown per region. So here on the interactive map, you can just select any region you'd like. So let's say, for example, I wanted to do the Southwest region. It then auto-populates to these different organizational profiles that include an overview and a breakdown. It includes information about their website, a point of contact as available, social media as available. And then what we also have is, if you read more and it goes to the organization profile, not only does it provide an overview, which is approved and written, and we collaborate with the organization itself before anything is published at all. We also include keywords such as like a school-based program or a training program. We also include keywords related to populations served, if they serve the tribal community or schools or Native youth, and their scope of work. For example, developing skills and opportunities for tribal community members, or promoting healthy food and healthy communities. All of this information and these keywords come from that survey, that second level tier survey that I discussed earlier, that we share and collaborate with the organization to be able to identify these different filters so that funders can connect with their work. So this is what the organization profile looks like. And this, as I said, this directory is supposed to be a living resource. It's supposed to be something that is continually updated. It's easier than having something that's printed because work changes, right? And we see even with this year how sometimes directions of organizations can change with COVID, right? You have rapid response, and that could really alter some of the direction of the organizations themselves. And we want to be able to have a resource that can be updated in real time. And then not only are these keywords clickable and you can kind of flow through as you go through the website, we also have the directory drop-down menu, as Josiah had showed before. Here are the filters. So we break it down based off of regions, organizational types, everything from the nonprofit to for-profit businesses. We break it down off of keywords like community garden or farm, cooking demonstrations, policy and research focused organizations. Populations, so this is populations served, if they serve Alaska Native, elders, Native youth, urban natives, and then scope of work. So building community assets, improving health outcomes for community members, increasing access to traditional food, and then you can select those. So let's say if I select Native youth, and then auto-populates those results there. So that is the directory. And then we have these profiles and innovation, as Josiah had mentioned. These are more in-depth views and interviews with our partner organizations. And they provide models and examples, and we're really grateful for them sharing their work with us. Like I said, they include interviews. You can click to read more. They have statistics. So really, it's a good foundational basis for funders who are looking at this resource to be able to learn more about who's leading this work. And then we also have a list of content experts to really help begin fostering those connections and relationships between philanthropic investors and our organizations and entities included on the directory. So if you have suggestions for these, we're always open to receiving feedback. Please stay in communication with us and our team. But again, these are links to their websites and additional information as available. And then we have, in addition to that, our fact sheets, which really help provide funders that foundational understanding of tribal sovereignty, Indian Country 101 and backgrounds, research in Native communities, and what that really looks like. We do have downloadable infographics and policy briefs. For example, this Indian Country 101 provides just the general diversity of Indian Country and what, how it's not just a one solution for everyone. There's so much diversity, and especially even the work that's being done. And then we also have an overview of Indian Country agriculture work. So this has an overview of American Indian and Alaska Native producers, and this could help provide that scope and help funders have that better basic understanding of this work that's happening. We also have our fact sheets here. These are really covering the topics of funding research in tribal communities, an overview of health disparities in nutrition, an overview of Indian Country agriculture and food systems, land, natural resources and water, and then tribal sovereignty and governance. So these are also there available to them. We also have additional resources, articles, media, and research, sort of this compilation of resources that the funders can take a deeper dive into. So these are constantly updated as well. And then the last piece here is just a little bit more information about some of our partners and really about why this matters and about the philanthropic investment in Indian country. So with that, I also want to do a quick overview of how you can submit information about your organization, because this is growing all the time. So if you would like to submit your organization and nominate that, or if there is a program or an entity in your community that you receive services from that you're just really wanting to highlight and have them included on this resource, please get in contact with us. If there's a delay in anything, you can always reach out to us via email. But this initial submission form allows for you to give an overview and what you know about the organization, and then how that process works. We then follow up with the organization that was nominated, either through the point of contact provided, or we'll do our own connections and let them know that we'd like to include them on this resource, or a community member would like to include them on this resource. And we then do that second level tier survey where we get additional information so that we can break down those filters and accurately represent the work that they're doing. We do obviously have our own data privacy. It's all voluntary. We don't publish any information without permission of the organization itself. So we just want to make sure that that's reiterated there. I'm a great point of contact, Whitney Sani. Josiah, if you want to put up our contact information there again, but that's just a brief overview of how this is structured. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you. I have a question for you all that somebody submitted, and it states, have you all been tracking the Justice for Black Farmers Act, wondering how Indigenous peoples were consulting and how we can work together for Black liberation on Native land?
I think that's a great opportunity. I'd love for the person to reach out to us directly so that we can learn more and find ways to partner, and also make connections through some of the organizations and entities that are leading this work on the ground. And I think this tool is a great way to start making those initial connections.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions? Please get them in now so we can make sure that you get those answered. Going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, here we go. We've got another question. Are there any plans to expand beyond those 2 imaginary lines to your north and your south?
I think that's a great opportunity to do that. Josiah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but would love to be able to expand this, even just to represent and accurately represent Indigenous communities, even just beyond the, our current 50 states. So.
Great, sorry about that. I don't know if I had paused something, but so I just wanted to share for those that are participating in this session, there is a little button that you'd have to click to submit questions. It's right next to the session details, and it's a live Q&A. So if you want to ask some questions, feel free to upload those questions in that little portion there. We do have one more question. How do you respond to researchers and people wanting to use this database? What does consent from folks in the directory look like?
Sorry, I had to unmute that for a second. So we do have a data privacy policy. We do, basically, as I mentioned, it's all voluntary participation. We ask for informed and affirmative consent. So anyone, although anyone can nominate an organization to be included in the directory, we do not automatically include that nominated organization upon receiving that. So we do seek informed consent from those organizations. And then we go through a collaborative process to develop the information that they would like to provide as an entry, as an organizational profile to be included. So all ownership of data, images, and other materials that are shared with us remain within the directory itself. And with the organizations or individuals that develop them. So that is kind of what we go through our process. It's not just an automatic submission and it's uploaded. We have a collaborative process with that entity to ensure that.
And building off of that, it's not our intent to kind of reflect that the community asset directory represents the entirety of work that is happening in Indian country to date. And we very much recognize that this is a living document, this is a living directory, and that we can only engage this space in a good way, as Whitney was saying, with that informed consent of the community asset member or organization that would be represented.
So it really can be utilized as a tool to start that relationship building and foster those connections. That's ultimately the purpose of that.
Okay, any more questions, Latasha, that you might see?
No, I don't see any other questions. So we can close out, or if you have any questions, Mike.
I don't. I just want to state, everybody, that thank you so much for spending your time with us today and for our two presenters. Also, I want to make sure that we give a big shout out to our sponsors for this particular section. And it was sponsored by the Champions of Native Agriculture and Resource Legacy Fund. Thank you so much. And also, our next session will be starting at 1 o'clock, correct, Latasha? Good. All good meetings start on time and all good meetings end on time. Once again, thank you all very much. We'll see the rest of you at 1 o'clock. And also, Indigenous. I got it right that time. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye now.
Thank you.